Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me this evening. For those of you who tried to attend the talk earlier today, I appreciate you coming back. And if you're just watching the recording later on, I appreciate that as well. So I'm excited to present this to you today. I realize that I'm standing between you and dinner for a lot of you, depending on your time zone. So I will be cognizant of the time and make sure that we stick to the hour that we've planned, and certainly no more than that. If you have any questions during the talk, please throw it in the Q&A. You can type it. I'll keep an eye on it as best I can. If I have time to answer questions, I will. If not, you can always email me. My website is anthonyworlando.com. Most of you are at Cal Poly, so you can just find me in the Cal Poly directory. I want to start with just a few quick thank yous. 3 thank yous in particular. The first one is to the Dean's office for organizing all of this. I really do appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, and it's because of them that this has been organized. The second thank you helps to explain my thought process a little bit while I was writing this. You know, when you're a professor, you spend most of your time writing for other professors. You do academic research. Now, I've been a writer for a while, and every writer, I think, has an audience in the back of their mind, who they're thinking they're writing for. When you're writing a sentence, when you're writing a page, who are you imagining is reading this thing, and what are they thinking about it? When I write my academic research, I think of those other professors, but that wasn't what was happening when I was writing this book. That's what I thought would happen. But my goal was to write a short, accessible book. So if you haven't gotten yourself a copy yet, if you haven't looked at it, I hope that you're not scared away from it being an academic book, because there are no equations in it. A few graphs, I try to make them simple. A few maps, I hope they're pretty, but hopefully it's an accessible narrative. So who was my audience in mind while I was writing this? Well, I realized after a while that I actually knew all along, and I just wasn't paying attention to it, because every time I sat down to write this book, everything that I wrote, I kept thinking to myself, what would my students think of this? How would I say it if I was standing in front of a classroom? Would they get it? Would they appreciate it? And if the answer was no, then I got to go back to the drawing board and do it over again. So if you get yourself a copy of the book, you'll see that it's dedicated to my students, but I want to thank them here because a lot of them are in the audience, and they're the reason why I'm presenting it here. The third thank you helps to begin our story about why I started researching this topic in the first place. This book is about redlining. Now, I think that there are probably, broadly speaking, 2 groups of Americans out there when it comes to redlining. The people who really know what it is, they know what the effects were, they understand the history, and they might feel that they're not going to get anything new out of this book. I hope they do. I'll tell you, I thought I knew a lot about redlining, and then I started doing the research for this book, and I discovered so much more. There are just layers and layers to this topic. So I hope you find it interesting, even if you've heard this history before a little bit. And then there's probably a larger group of Americans who barely know what it is, if they've ever heard of it before. If you fall in that camp, it's okay. I'm here to explain it to you. Redlining is quite simply a policy that the federal government had in place in the early to mid 20th century to direct mortgage lenders to give mortgages to some neighborhoods and not to others. And one of the reasons why we care about that is not just because it was the government telling the private market what to do, which is a little concerning in itself in how they invest their capital, but that it was discriminatory, that a lot of the neighborhoods that were directed not to receive mortgages were predominantly filled with groups of Americans who were considered bad credit risks, undesirable people in those days. Black families, Latino families, foreign immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Jews, Catholics. And this is not a controversial claim. You can see the redlining maps today, and the appraisers who drew them explain exactly why they picked money to go to one neighborhood and not to another. And they weren't shy about it. Now, these maps have existed for decades, obviously, but for most of that time, they've been stuck in the archives. What happened in recent times, only in the last few years, is that all these maps have been digitized. They've been put on the internet, and you can download all the data about exactly where all the boundaries were between the so-called good neighborhoods and the so-called bad neighborhoods. And that is incredibly valuable for a researcher like me, because it means that I can marry that map with data. I can say a family lived on this side of the line and another family lived on that side of the line. How did their lives turn out? Were they different? This is a natural experiment. It answers the question, did the line matter? And the answer of the book is yes, to a great extent, but not just that it mattered back then, but that it actually continues to matter to this day. You may not know where the line is. You're walking through a neighborhood in your daily life and you have no idea where those maps drew those lines. You've never seen the maps in your life. You may be stepping over a boundary any given day, but it has shaped people's lives, even though it's invisible. Now, I know a thing or two about that kind of data and those kind of maps, but there are people who know how to do those things better than I do. And two of them in particular have been invaluable to me. When I first started looking at the redlining maps, I wasn't doing it alone. I was doing it with Brian Am, who's a professor at Georgia Tech, and Sieva Rodniansky, who's a professor at Occidental College. Everything in this book stands on their shoulders, and so my final thank you has to go to them. They gave me the blessing to write this book, if only so that they would have the time to keep doing the hard work of crunching through the numbers. Let me tell you the story of a little bit about what we found. Now, in the book, I break it up into basically two pieces that you can think of. If you pull up the table of contents, you'll just see all the chapters listed, but I think it's helpful to think of it in two halves. The first half of the chapters focuses on the causes of redlining, and the second focuses on the effects. Today, we're going to talk mostly about the causes, and well, I got to give you a reason to buy the book. You can learn about the effects as you read through it. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's start by talking about those causes. To tell that story, let me tell you the story about Richard R. Wright. Now, this is not to be confused with Richard Wright, the great author. This is a different Richard Wright, someone who I think should be in our American history books, frankly, but for most of us, he's not. If you're like me, you never heard about him in your textbooks. And that's a shame, because he has a fascinating story. Richard Wright was born as a slave on a Georgia plantation. He was emancipated when he was a young kid, and he went on to live a pretty storied life in Savannah, Georgia. He served in the Spanish-American War, where he rose to the rank of major. And for the rest of his life, people in Savannah would still refer to him as Major Wright. He became principal of one of the first publicly funded Black high schools in America, and he became one of the first Black college presidents in our country's history, a position that he held for 3 decades. This is the late 19th century, when something like this is pretty rare. He was a very brilliant, highly educated, distinguished member of society. And one day, when he was 65 years old, his daughter went into a bank and was refused service, while the white woman who was standing next to her got excellent service. And she very politely asked why. They didn't like this. They physically attacked her and threw her out of the bank. This stung her father. He had spent his life trying to educate his people in Savannah, Georgia, so that they would have the same opportunities as the white residents of the town. And here he was finding not only that his daughter was abusively treated, but the broader lesson was that education wasn't enough. He would not be able to get access to the same opportunities, especially the same financial opportunities, as white residents. So he left. After all those years in Georgia, for the first time in his life at the age of 65, he moved north to Philadelphia, and he opened his own bank. That takes some courage, in my opinion. Not only did he open his own bank, but he looked around for how many other Black owners of banks were out there. And there weren't that many, but there were a few dozen like him who were trying to do a very difficult thing. It is hard to run a bank when the population that you're trying to serve doesn't have a lot of money. You want to lend to them, but the money you get to lend comes from deposits. And if they don't have a lot to deposit, you don't have a lot of capital to start with. It's what economists would call a classic poverty trap. He was trying to break that trap, and so were others. And so together, they founded, and he became the first president of, the National Negro Bankers Association, the NNBA. And for the next 20 plus years, he would travel up and down the Eastern Seaboard, bucking up the other members, meeting with them once a year in a great big conference, sharing best practices as they struggled against a white establishment that controlled the banking industry and didn't want them to be a part of it. He finally died at the age of 92 when he was still fighting this fight, believe it or not, to his dying day. Now, he didn't live to see his dream come true, but he hoped that the next generation and the one after that and the one after that would carry on his goal. And I start with that story because his goal is our goal. In writing a book like this and in reading a book like this, the goal is to figure out how to achieve access to affordable credit for all Americans, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of skin color. This is the story of how we have failed him. Richard Wright was one of millions of Americans who joined the Great Migration. Now, I'm an economist by training, and so I would like to say that something like the Great Migration was driven by economics, because that makes it easy for me to study and easy to prescribe solutions and policies to go along with it. But the truth that you find when you study most of the research that's done on most mass migrations is that they're rarely driven by economics, and this one was no different. I use the word refugees throughout the book when I refer to the Great Migration, and that's intended because the Black Southerners who were leaving the South during this time period and moving north to the cities, they didn't necessarily want to do that. They felt kicked out of their land. They weren't leaving because they saw great economic opportunity necessarily, although some of them did. They were leaving first and foremost because of violence. There's some good evidence of this, and there actually is a tiny bit of economics bound up in that violence. The famous sociologist Edna Bonisich has a theory called the split labor market. The way it works is like this. If you have two groups of people who are competing for the same jobs, if the jobs are plentiful, that might not be such a problem. Everybody gets a job and everybody's fine. But as soon as those jobs become scarce, unemployment goes up, economic growth slows down, times are tough. If one of those groups has more power in society, they will use it violently to prevent the other group from getting the scarce jobs. And that's exactly what we find when we do research on the South at this time period. At times and places where unemployment went up and economic growth slowed, that is exactly when lynchings increased. And it was particularly led by the low-skilled white workers and not by the rich plantation owners. And when lynchings increase in a particular county, that's one of the best predictors that Black families are going to leave. I mention this because this sets the stage for our story. To understand why, when they got to the cities, they faced such difficulties. Some people look at it and say, well, they wanted to be there. They were going after economic opportunity, but no, to a large extent, they were forced to move to these cities. They hoped that it would be better than what they were leaving. And in some ways it was. But a lot of the problems that they faced were not problems that they welcomed. They stumbled into these cities just trying to find a better place to live, and that changed the demographics of the cities in ways that the white residents who lived in those cities didn't really like. Let's look at a particular case study. So if you've ever been to Chicago, you might know that the lake is on the eastern side here of the city. In those days, if you were coming up from the south, you would have ridden the rail line. The train would have come up the coast. And so you would have seen on the right-hand side the water. And on the left-hand side, what would you have seen? Well, in the early days of our cities, very close to the city centers, you could find a lot of factories and a lot of distribution plants, a lot of smokestacks, dirty areas, but important areas of manufacturing and so on. And they were almost always located along the train lines. Because if you're going to start a factory and you're going to produce a lot of goods, you want to be able to put it right on the train and ship it to where it's got to go. Now, just naturally, people don't want to live there. People don't want to live with smokestacks billowing into their backyards. So the only people who could live near the rail lines would be the people who couldn't afford to go anywhere else. These were the cheapest parts of the city, the least valuable real estate, with also the cheapest buildings built on it, because that's where the poorest residents would find themselves. So if you're coming up from the south and you are a new entrant, a newcomer with no money, and you are starting at the bottom of the labor hierarchy, not only because you're a newcomer, but because you are considered the bottom part of that split labor market. Split labor market didn't stay in the south. It followed them up to the north. So where would you go? You would come up here along the eastern side, and you would stop right around here at Central Station. Now, keep an eye on this, because this is the beginnings of the south side. The darker the map, the higher the proportion of Black residents who are living there. Okay? Now, why is that the case? Well, you would come in to Central Station, one of the finest train stations in America at the time, in a city that had tremendous public transportation at the time. And as you got out, you would be looking out at Grant Park. Grant Park was on the north end of what we'd call the South Side today. And from there, you would march on your heels south to where the cheapest real estate was, because that's what you could afford. But in exchange for that, you would be living near the factories and the clattering rail lines, the noise and the congestion and the pollution that nobody really wanted to live near, but that's where you had to go. And this is a picture of some of the tenements from that area. The point is this: at the beginning of it all, the segregation that existed was first and foremost economic. It was driven by purchasing power. And we're not just talking about this area being full of Black migrants from the South, but also foreign immigrants were very high presence here, particularly from poorer countries in Southern and Eastern Europe that at that time were considered lower on the hierarchy, or you might even call it, as I do in the book, a caste system, than other groups of immigrants or people who'd been living in America for more generations than that. It wasn't just Chicago. As I show in the book, you can find the exact same story when you look at Pittsburgh. In this dark colored area in the center here, the darkest neighborhood right here, this is called Hill District. Still exists today, still has a pretty high Black population, and it was right near Union Station. Same exact story. You come in on the trains. Where are you going to go live? You're going to stay right there near the trains where nobody else wants to stay. If you had money, you would go further away from all of that commotion. And the same thing in Boston, to give you one more example. This area here is what is known today as the South End, and it's very close to South Station, which was the busiest train station in the world at this time. Even today, economists have found that one of the ways you can predict where low-income residents are going to live in a city is by looking at where the public transportation is at. Low-income residents can't afford cars. They need to be near the jobs. They're going to be near the cheapest public transportation that they can find. This changed the cities. It wasn't everybody moving into the cities. It was primarily Black Americans. This is the exodus from the South as the violence ramped up in the South. And you can see that they were moving to all portions, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, although especially the Northeast and the Midwest, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, etc. You don't see the same picture when you look at white immigration. Now, the white population was larger, so there still are a lot of white Americans moving, but percentage-wise, they don't change the demographics of the cities the way that the Great Migration does. And that is what leads us into seeing policies enacted that would affect our real estate, our built environment, our cities, our neighborhoods, and the access to opportunities between these groups for decades and decades to come. It all started in the Roaring 20s. Now, a lot of people think of the Roaring 20s, they think of the stock market booming. I don't talk much about that in the book because, well, frankly, I've been studying that period of American history for years, ever since I was in grad school, because it's fascinating. Scholars still argue over what caused the Great Depression. And the evidence is pretty strong that the housing market was one of the biggest drivers of the boom and the bust, and it's one of the most underappreciated pieces of the story. And it's the most important part of the story for us because it leads to a transformation in the housing and the mortgage markets that is going to trigger the government to draw those maps. So let's start by talking about what this boom looked like. What really was happening is that cars were taking off. I make a joke in the book that we can't blame the boom and the bust on Henry Ford, but he's a good place to start. And that's because his affordable Model T made the United States very different from Europe. In Europe, initially, the car industry was focused on making expensive, customized cars for wealthy consumers. The American industry was much more interested in making an affordable, easy to replicate car that could be sold to the masses. You're not going to get a custom, beautiful, fancy car, but you're going to get something that you can afford with a middle-class wage. Henry Ford used to joke that you could get a Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. This changes our cities. As soon as you can drive, and wherever we're willing to put roads, you can go. And it's way easier to build a road than it is to build a train line and to put a train on it. The train restricted where people could go. As soon as you have cars, you can go between those train lines. And that means you're opening up all that land for development. So throughout the Roaring 20s, there's this tremendous growing demand for the suburbs, where everybody can have their own plot of land because now they can drive to it. And part of what happens is that people leave the rural areas and move into the cities. People of all races and ethnicities. Even in the South, which was a very predominantly agricultural area, you see a big increase in urbanization. And you see it even more in the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast, to the point where by 1940, over half of Americans, for the first time in history, are living in cities. And most of them are moving to these suburbs where they can live and they can drive into work or drive to wherever else they want. This creates a blessing and a curse. The blessing and the curse is at the top of this triangle. It's called marketability. I like this little model called the bubble triangle. It was devised by the financial economists William Quinn and John Turner, who have a wonderful book that came out in the last couple of years called Boom and Bust. If you're interested in financial bubbles, I highly recommend it. They like to think of all bubbles as kind of following this framework. And it makes a lot of sense. One of the things that it makes sense about is this starting point here is not a crazy starting point. What marketability means is that all of a sudden, some asset, some investment becomes easier to get. That's all it means. Some innovation happened. And I like this because I've spent a lot of time studying bubbles myself, and they all start with a good idea. In retrospect, it looks like everybody went crazy, herd behavior over the cliff. But if you go back to the very beginning, you say, well, how did they go crazy? Well, they started with a good idea. People wouldn't have jumped on it in the first place if there wasn't some kernel of useful value in this asset. That's what happened with cars and land in the 1920s. All this vast land can be developed. Everybody can build a house. We can develop our cities, subdivide all these plots of land. It actually makes sense. But then it gets out of control. How? Well, there's two other pieces of the triangle. One, which I'll show you in a moment, is that there has to be a big infusion of money and credit to the point where the credit becomes cheap, people can borrow too much, and they can buy even more of that investment than they really should, even more than they actually have good uses for. And when that starts, that's when short-term investors jump in. And they start buying, not because they care about the underlying asset, not because they care about the value that the investment will have in the long run, whether anybody will use that plot of land or use that house or enjoy living there. They don't care about any of that. These short-term traders are only buying for one reason, because prices are going up. They know that prices have to come back down eventually because the prices are going up past the point where people are going to be able to get any value out of it. They're overpaying relative to what they're going to get. But the short-term traders don't care. They're hoping to buy, ride the wave up, and sell before the bubble pops. And that is how speculation works. And that's the final piece of the triangle. These three pieces together. So let's move over to the money and credit side and see how that came out of this land boom. I call it the financialization of the land boom. And the financialization you need to buy real estate is mortgages, which leads us into the financial instrument that is going to drive redlining. If you look from the late 19th century, when this data set begins, some of the only data that really exists nationally in the country was a little tough to find, but I dug it up in the archives. You can follow how mortgages grow, whether you measure it in billions of dollars or as a growth rate to see how fast it's growing relative to the previous year. Both of these things, the lines and the bars, tell the same story, which is there's a little bit of growth in the early 20th century. And then when you hit 1920, oh man, does it shoot up until the mid to late 20s. And you can already see the bust starting to happen here. This is the interesting thing, because one of the things that the Nobel Prize winner Vernon Smith has found in his research is that the markets that usually trigger a really bad recession, those markets start turning down a couple years before the recession happens. You actually need to see a real implosion happening for a while before it takes down the rest of the economy. And that's actually what happens here in the mortgage market. But look at this unprecedented growth in mortgages. This is lenders seeing an opportunity for all these people who want to buy homes and jumping on top of it. And you may say to yourself, so what? Why is that a bad thing? How do we know that all these loans weren't necessary or wanted? Well, let me put on my financial economist hat and try to understand what's going on. First of all, you've got four different types of lenders, and they're issuing a very specific type of mortgage that it's important to understand, because this type of mortgage is going to be at the core of the Great Depression, and it's going to be at the core of the reforms that redlining is designed to address. Nowadays, the vast majority of mortgages that people get to buy homes in this country are long-term fixed rate mortgages. You get a loan for 30 years and the mortgage payment never changes, fixed rate. Same interest rate all the way through. That's what most people get. That's not what existed back then. We don't have to get into all the hairy finance of it, but the reason is because lenders don't want to be locked into a contract for that long at the same interest rate. They take on a lot of risk when they do that. Remember, they're borrowing with short-term deposits that can run out the door any minute. They give money to borrowers for 30 years at the same interest rate. They're hoping that it pays off. The market could change and all of a sudden that doesn't look like such a good contract anymore, but they're locked into it. So back in the day, they didn't issue long-term fixed rate mortgages. Back before we had the regulations and the government subsidies that we have today, back then, they issued short-term mortgages, 3 years, 5 years, maybe adjustable rates. But you can't pay off a house in 3 years. So what do? You pay off a little bit of the house and you get to the end of the 3 years and you have a lot still left over. And it comes due all at once because your 3 years are up. Well, you can't afford that payment. So you get another 3-year mortgage and you pay off a little bit of it. You get to the end of the 3 years, you still got a lot left over. So you get another 3-year mortgage and you string these mortgages together. It's called rolling over the debt. It was very common back then. And that works fine as long as every time you need to get a new loan to pay off the old loan, there's a lender who's willing to give it to you. And that works when the market is going up. Lenders are happy to issue new loans. But what happens if the music stops and you need a new loan and the economy is tanking? We'll come back to that. Now, let's answer that question of whether this makes sense. And the answer depends on how you look at interest rates. Now, here's the most finance you'll get out of me today, the most that you have to follow. Hopefully it's simple enough. You can understand how the perception of risk is changing in the market by looking at interest rates. What do I mean by the perception of risk? I mean this. Well, if you're a lender, the interest rate that you charge is compensation for risk. You charge a higher interest rate when you're more worried because you're worried that borrowers are more likely to default in the future. You've got to charge them a higher interest rate to cover your potential losses. That's called a risk premium. It's not the entire interest rate, but we can measure that risk premium. I explain how to do it in the book. And the point is this. When people really, really want mortgages because they want to buy homes, it tends to drive up that risk premium because it drives up the demand for mortgages, which means a lot of more mortgages are going to go out the door and some of them are going to go to riskier borrowers, and that drives up that risk premium. And it's also because if more and more people want mortgages, well, just like anything else, more demand drives up prices. So lenders can charge higher interest rates. And sure enough, that's what we find from 1920 to 1924. Now, as far as I can tell, I don't think anybody's ever calculated these numbers for the 20s before. So this is actually one of the understated accomplishments of the book, is that I was able to find these data and calculate these things. But what happens during a credit bubble is the opposite. Even as the market booms in price and more people get mortgages and the riskiness of the borrowers increases, even as all those things happen, the risk premium goes down. Well, why would that be? Why would lenders be charging less even when they're issuing more and more mortgages to riskier and riskier borrowers? And the answer is they want to make money off of this bubble. They are so desperate to issue mortgages and make money off of them in the short run that they will actually drop the price of risk and not worry about what will happen in the long run. And that's what we find happened in the second half of the 20th century. This is a classic measure of a credit bubble. And my friend Pam has said that it looks like 2008, and that's exactly what I thought when I looked at this graph. Because I've seen these graphs for 2008, for the bubble leading up to that crisis. I've never seen it for the 20s, and well, it looks pretty spot on. The interesting thing about all this is that it didn't happen equally across the cities. These are some home prices that we have for New York City. It's hard to get home prices going back this far, but there are a couple economists who were able to dig them up for New York City, basically by going back and reading the paper reports one by one and adding all the numbers together. The high-end neighborhoods, which were predominantly white, experienced a huge surge in prices because of all those mortgages. But the so-called low-end neighborhoods, which had a lot more Black, foreign immigrant, and so on residents, they didn't have that kind of bubble. In fact, by the end of the 1920s, they were back to approximately the same price that they were at the very beginning. Now, why is this? This is the question that helps us to understand why redlining was a spatial rather than an individual human being concept. In other words, why was redlining applied to neighborhoods and not to individual borrowers? It's one thing to discriminate against a person who comes into your office and asks for a loan, but it's actually a very different thing to discriminate against an entire neighborhood without even bothering to interview any of them. And that's because redlining emerged out of the segregationist policies that were developing during this era. And there were a couple of them. As the Great Migration was happening and people were moving into the cities, the Black neighborhoods were starting to swell. They were getting bigger and bigger. There were more and more people. They were spreading outwards. And all the white neighborhoods that were surrounding them didn't want the Black residents to move into their white neighborhood. Now, sometimes they simply enforced that with pure violence. There are a lot of stories, and I don't tell them all in the book, but there are a lot of stories, I only give you a couple of them, where Black resident tries to move into a neighborhood and the white neighbors set off bombs on their front porch and violently attack the families. This was happening in all the major northern cities. It's important to understand because a lot of people think, well, they left the violence in the South, that was over. It wasn't. One of the people who that happened to was a man named William McMahon. He lived in Baltimore and he moved into a white neighborhood, and his neighbors didn't like it. And the violence was so intense that the police department had to put special protections around his house. And so the mayor at the time decided that to help the Black residents, like William McMahon, he would institute a new ordinance that told Black families to stay in their neighborhoods and not to move into white neighborhoods. In other words, he was saying for their own good, he would prevent them from moving where they wanted to because he couldn't be held accountable for what white residents would do. This was called racial zoning. Now we have zoning today. It doesn't look anything like that. But back then there was an ordinance that said this was the white neighborhood and that was the Black neighborhood. That lasted until 1917, when Charles Buchanan sued William Warley. William Warley was brilliant, in my opinion. William Warley was a black resident who wanted to buy a house from a white homeowner named Charles Buchanan. But there was a racial zoning law in place that said that William Warley couldn't move into that neighborhood. So Warley thought he'd test it. He came to Buchanan. He said, I'd like to buy your house. I'd like to move in. Buchanan said, great, good opportunity. William Warley offered more money than anybody else. Buchanan said yes. And then right before they signed the deal, Warley backed out. And he said, wait a second, I can't move into this house if there's a zoning ordinance in place that says I can't. And so I know you wanted me to buy this house, but I can't do it because I won't break the law. And Charles Buchanan said, oh no, I'm going to lose some money. And he sued him. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court overturned racial zoning, not because William Warley was losing anything, but because Charles Buchanan, the white man, was losing out on the money he would have gained from selling the house. That was Warley's genius. He knew that the way to overturn racial zoning was to show that it was hurting the pocketbook of a white homeowner. And it worked. So in 1917, racial zoning gets eliminated. But that doesn't end the way things work. Cities get a little more creative. They start coming up with comprehensive zoning plans. Well, comprehensive zoning made some sense. The idea was basically there are things that we need to restrict now that our cities are becoming overflowing with people and all different sorts of land uses. And so we need to do two things. One is density zoning, which means we need to restrict the amount of real estate you can build on a particular piece of land. Because buildings are getting too big and they're crowding up next to other buildings. We need to space them apart. We need to push them back from the street. Anything that restricts how much you can build on a particular land size-wise is density zoning. The other kind of zoning was use zoning. And when most people think of zoning nowadays, that's what they think of. You draw a map and you break it up into regions and you say, here, you can only use the land for residential homes. Over here, you can use the land for industrial factories. And we don't want to conflate the two because we don't want the factories to be billowing smoke into the backyards of the homeowners, and some kids are going to breathe that in and get asthma. Except the economists Allison Schertzer, Tate Twynham, and Randall Walsh have gone back, dug up those maps, and overlaid them with the demographics of who was living there at the time and found pretty darn clearly that the way the cities were zoned were so that all the tall buildings, poor construction, minimal building codes, industrial factory uses, all of those things that you wouldn't want in your backyard were imposed on the Black neighborhoods. And to a lesser extent, the foreign immigrant neighborhoods. We're already starting to see a divergence between how they're treated. There's a hierarchy in this caste system, and the Black residents are on the bottom and the foreign immigrants are a little higher up and everybody else is higher than that. And all those negative things were not imposed on the white suburbs. And so we start to see that this segregation is no longer just economic, it's now being enforced. And the last way that it's enforced is through restrictive covenants. If the zoning doesn't work, the private citizens will institute policies of their own. Restrictive covenants go into the deed of the house. A developer builds a suburban development and puts it in the deed of the house that says, you can never sell this property to a certain type of person. And so there are these heinous language in these restrictive covenants that says this house can only be sold to a Caucasian family. This house can never be sold to a Jewish family. These things are recorded for all of time. The economists Aradhya Sood, William Spiegel, and Kevin Ehrman Solberg have looked at the deeds. And they have found that it was not the wealthy white neighborhoods that were most likely to have the restrictive covenants. It was the working class white neighborhoods, the lower skilled workers. Why? Remember that split labor market that Edna Bonasich talked about that was in the South? This is the same idea. The wealthy white homeowners aren't worried because the Black residents can't afford their homes. It's the folks who are a little step up on the ladder who are worried that Black residents are going to move into their neighborhoods. Just like we had a split labor market, now we have a split housing market. And then it all comes crashing down. The Great Depression occurs, and we don't need to linger too long on this because we've all learned about the Great Depression in our history classes. But what you may not realize is that it was a massive housing crisis. Huge increase in homelessness. Remember those short-term loans that you had to roll over in order to stay in your house? You need a new loan to pay off the old loan. When unemployment goes up and banks start going bankrupt, they're not issuing new loans. And so people have to default on their homes and the banks have to foreclose on them. And that opens the door for redlining because now the federal government has to come in and figure out a way to end this housing crisis and help all of these people who are losing their homes. The irony of it all, of course, is that the bubble was concentrated in the high-end neighborhoods. So the low-end neighborhoods don't have that far to fall. And so by the end of the 1940s, believe it or not, after 20 years of boom and bust, the high-end neighborhoods grew at the exact same rate as the low-end neighborhoods. Kind of interesting. This massive financial crisis, where lenders stop lending and lending growth actually turns negative for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Only 8 years later does it even start to turn a tiny bit positive. That's why the Great Depression was so deep and so long. And that is what leads the federal government into trying to save the system. And that's when they create the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the City Survey Program. The Homeowners Loan Corporation works like this. Franklin Roosevelt comes up with this idea with his advisors. We're going to create a government-sponsored corporation. We'll spin it off as an independent entity. It won't be run by the government, but we'll put some money behind it and we'll guarantee its loans for a little while. And what this corporation is going to do is it's going to go to the lenders and it's going to say, all those loans that are in foreclosure, that you're losing money on because nobody's paying them back, we'll take them off your hands. And in exchange, we'll give you a bond and we will pay you regular payments. So you're going to receive bond payments and you don't have to worry about that borrower who defaulted on their mortgage. It's a good deal. Then they turn to the borrower and they say, hey, we own your mortgage now. We bought it from the bank. And we're going to make a deal with you because we want you to stay in your house. The deal is this. You know that 3-year or 5-year loan that you can't afford? We're going to turn it into a 15 or 20 or 25-year loan. We're going to stretch it out longer and make all the payments smaller so that if you have a longer time to pay it off, but you have smaller payments along the way, you might actually be able to afford the house. And it works. They get a massive swell of applications. Not everybody qualifies, but over the next year and a half, little by little, they refinance these loans so that after a couple of years, they have refinanced over 1 million mortgages. Think about this, okay? This is a national corporation in a country that did not have national banking at the time. It was mostly community banking. So this is the first time anybody has refinanced mortgages all over the country all at once. And they do over 1 million of them in less than 2 years. They hire 20,000 people in only 15 months. They refinance 1/5 of all residential mortgages in the country. I'll say that again. They refinance over 1/5 of all residential mortgages in the country and over 1/10 of all homes in the country. Out of all the houses, they refinance 1/10 of them, in less than 2 years. It's almost impossible to imagine. And here's the other thing. They do it with very little discrimination. Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, black homeowners and white homeowners receive the refinancing. And this is a key to helping you understand what's going to happen in the second half of this book, the part that I'm not going to tell you about today. The black neighborhoods are actually more likely to repay the loans than the white neighborhoods. They have a better repayment rate. In other words, the black neighborhoods are more creditworthy than the white neighborhoods. Remember that, because when they adopt redlining, they make the opposite assumption. The City Survey Program was the next step in their work. Now, if I had a lot of time, I would click on this link and show you the maps, but I'm going to leave it to you. So if you want to look at the maps, you can look at your own city, your own neighborhood, you can zoom into your neighborhood, and you can click on the map and it'll tell you exactly what the appraisers said about your neighborhood back in the day. The website you're looking for is called the Mapping Inequality Project. Mapping Inequality. It's run by Richard Nelson and the University of Richmond, but he has teamed up with several other universities because this was a massive undertaking to create. And when I said that is those digitized maps are the reason why we can do this kind of research, well, we all owe him a debt of gratitude, obviously. Here's why the city survey program happened, because this is one thing that hasn't been well understood in a lot of the historical literature, but I was able to find some new evidence that elucidates it a little better. A lot of people thought that the maps were drawn in order for the Homeowners Loan Corporation to do the work that they did. In other words, that appraisers drew maps and divided them into neighborhoods and gave them different ratings, A, B, C, D, so that the Homeowners Loan Corporation would know where to lend and where not to lend. But that's not right. As I just told you, the Homeowners Loan Corporation didn't discriminate much. Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods had their loans refinanced. No, the maps actually came second. What happened was the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, who was the regulator who was overseeing all of this, they realized that the Homeowners Loan Corporation was very restricted in who they could help. They could only help people, according to Congress, the statute that governed them, they could only help homeowners who were in foreclosure. Now, there were millions of Americans who were in foreclosure who needed help, but there were even more homeowners who were struggling. Maybe they defaulted on one or two payments. They were having trouble making their payments, but they weren't officially in foreclosure yet, and so they weren't eligible for help. So the Federal Home Loan Bank Board said, here's what we're going to do. In the last 2 years, while the corporation, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, has been doing this unprecedented work, they've done something that nobody else has done. They have reinvented the process of valuing homes rapidly all over the country. They have brought new scientific techniques to figuring out whether a particular house deserves to be refinanced, whether a particular neighborhood deserves loans. So what we want to do is we want to take all these appraisers across the country that they've worked with, and we want them to create maps of their cities. And then we can give those maps to all the private lenders in the cities, all the banks who are still afraid to lend in the depth of the Great Depression. And we'll give them information that'll make them more confident. We'll share with them the new appraisal techniques that we learned. And then we'll encourage them to go out there and jumpstart the housing industry again, because now they know who to lend to and who not to lend to. So they went out and they drew up these maps. In every city, they had their criteria. How do you know what a bad neighborhood looks like? Well, part of it is because it has deteriorated housing. Maybe it has low-income residents. But a lot of the instructions that they followed, and we have those instructions, and I will warn you, if you go to the Mapping Inequality Project and you read what's on there, or you read parts of the book, some of it's going to be triggering because it's the kind of language that is offensive to us nowadays. But at the time, they felt that it was perfectly reasonable to explain that a neighborhood should not get loans if Black families lived there. Not only if Black families lived there, if there was a possibility of Black families entering the neighborhood in the near future. They were terrified of that. The language is astonishing. They're like looking around every corner to see if a Black family might be coming in. Even though, as we know, Black families did not get caught up in that huge bubble in the 1920s, which suggests they might actually be better at dealing with the housing market, and they were more likely to repay the Hulk loans. Yet they had these prejudices. Now, the economists Price Fishback, Jessica LaVoice, Alan Schertzer, and Randall Walsh have gone back and looked at the maps and done some statistical analysis to try to figure out how related was the drawing of the lines to race. Because we know race wasn't the only factor. We know that deteriorated housing and economics were other factors why they liked some neighborhoods over other neighborhoods. And they find that race is part of the story, but in a lot of ways, they're just drawing the lines where segregation already exists, where the zoning maps were. And so you might have a question. And this is one of the questions that I leave you with, because this is the question that a lot of the second half of the book is determined to answer. The question is, did the maps really matter? We know they were drawn. We know they were somewhat racist. We know their reasons were racist, but statistically, whether they actually furthered racism or just continued it, that's an open question. But did the maps, first of all, did they actually determine the way that lending happened? The answer is yes. I show a lot of evidence of that in the book about how the banks were instructed to follow the maps and how the regulators followed the maps too. And they wouldn't offer government subsidies to any mortgage that went into D-graded neighborhoods, which were shaded in red. And that's where the name redlining comes from. So we know that it happened. We know that it was followed. But if you know the history of restrictive covenants and zoning and everything that came before it, you might think redlining just followed what was already happening. It didn't create segregation. And that's a big debate in the economics literature nowadays, and I take it head on in the book. And I would give you two answers to that. The first is that actually there is quite a good bit of evidence that it made segregation a lot worse, and that where it drew the lines mattered. That all of a sudden, some areas would be much more disadvantaged because of redlining in ways that they weren't disadvantaged just because of zoning or other policies that existed. Finance matters. It matters where we have access to affordable credit. It's not enough to say we zoned this area so that you can or can't build an apartment building there. It also matters whether we allow those neighborhoods to have access to the financial system to build new things and better things. But the other answer I would give you, and I think this cuts to the heart of why redlining is so offensive, even beyond the discrimination that it clearly was. It's because when you draw a map in the 1930s and you instruct lenders to follow the same map for the next 30 years, what you are saying is you do not expect the neighborhoods to change. You do not think that the people who are living in those neighborhoods have the ability to overcome their past. Maybe it was a low-income neighborhood in the 1920s, but why does it have to be a low-income neighborhood in the 40s and 50s and 60s? Redlining said that it had to be. Redlining froze those problems in place. And it said to lenders, don't give these residents money to overcome their struggles. And as a result, one of the things I discovered in the book, in the research, and I show in one of the graphs that we don't have time for today, is that even as Black Americans were advancing socioeconomically, their wages were catching up to white wages. Their education status was catching up to white education status. All of these other metrics were improving. Their home ownership rates plummeted because they were denied access to the housing market. They were denied access to affordable credit. They were denied access to the American dream. In the rest of the book, I try to understand just how that affected the people who lived in those neighborhoods and how they split our cities in ways that, honestly, the people who were living in other neighborhoods often had no idea about. But it has led to some pretty dangerous views nowadays that those neighborhoods either are beyond help or don't deserve help or are struggling for reasons that are their own faults, or that living in a neighborhood that's high opportunity doesn't mean that you have any obligation to try to help people who are living in opportunities with low neighborhoods to either move to the high opportunity neighborhoods or to improve the low opportunity neighborhoods. And I think that one of the goals that I have now that I have written the book is to convince people that those kind of changes need to happen. This history needs to be told, not just because it's important to know, but because its legacy lingers on. And so I think the final accomplishment of the book is to try to connect the dots about how it connects to all the injustices that we see around us today, from the black-white wealth gap to concentrated poverty to all sorts of discrimination that we still find in the housing market, even though redlining itself has technically been outlawed. I know the story I've told isn't the happiest story in the world today. I appreciate you for sticking with it with me. But I hope you find that when you get to the end of the book, there is an uplifting message. And that is that we can learn from heroes like Richard Wright, who did make progress on bringing affordable credit to his people. And there are other heroes throughout the book who have done the same thing in different ways. And I hope that after reading the book, you feel the way I felt after writing it, which is that theirs is a legacy that we need to pick up and carry over the finish line. We have much work yet to be done, but I do believe that we can do it. Thanks for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk about these issues anytime. In the meantime, have a great night, everyone.